in.
Okay.
Here we go. Everyone in. So come in. There's going to be a lot more people joining in the next 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Come in. Okay, great. So, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Islamic courses session. Just want to make sure everyone's in now. There should be a lot more people coming in. I'll allow you, but we just need to start. Welcome to the session, Indian Islamic Studies, Past, Present, and Future, an interview with Professor Richard Eaton from the University of Arizona. And it's hosted by Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who's a professor of Islamic Intellectual History and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. Just a quick reminder to everyone, it is being recorded. So if you could please keep your phones or devices on mute or silent. And if you're not on our mailing list, just leave your email on the chat. And there is a Q&A session. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Professor Sajjad. And welcome to both of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, let me just close my WhatsApp because it's making noises. Hello, good afternoon, good morning to all of you out there. It's a real pleasure to have this conversation today with Professor Richard Eaton. He's a professor of history at the University of Arizona, and I've certainly known his work since the time I was a grad student in the previous century. It's a real pleasure because it intersects with some of my own interests. His work is intersected with some of my own interests, particularly in the recent past. Before we really begin the conversation, what I thought I'd do is I just mention some of his works that I've read and what I've taken away from them. That might then also connect to some of the questions that we will discuss and the conversation as it develops. So the first two works of Richard's that I came across were his two early works. I think I first read Rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier when it had come out. So I was just about starting as a grad student. And for me, it was an interesting, refreshing way of looking at, I guess, one of these classic kind of problematics in the study of Islam, which is where, in a sense, is the center. How do we define Islam? How does it develop and emerge in certain contexts? And what are the roles of certain social phenomena, which we often discuss in the study of Islam in South Asia, such as Sufism? What sort of social and political role, as well as a cultural and intellectual, does it have? And after that, of course, I read his Sufis of Bijapur, which I believe is Richard's dissertation. And again, I found it interesting the way in which it was engaging with questions around method. You know, how do we study Sufism? How do we look at the socio-political embeddedness of these sorts of phenomena and not perhaps consider questions of Sufism or Islamic thought perhaps as being somehow disembodied from their contexts. And to a certain extent, I think this kind of focus on the social embedded and embodied nature of ideas and of practices and of behaviors. You can see this being extended in a work that he later wrote about a decade after that, A Social History of the Deccan, which I've actually set a number of times as reading in classes, which is a really interesting kind of set of sort of accounts of individuals and their social context. And of course, it is one of the volumes in the new Cambridge history of Islam, of India, sorry. And then I thought I'd just mention two other works. One is, of course, the original article and then the book he wrote on temple desecration. And what I found interesting there, and it's become in many ways even more acute nowadays, is how it is that historians who work on South Asia, who work on Indian history, who work on Islam in South Asia, cannot really avoid some of the wider public debates that are going on, which are highly politicized in the Indian public sphere. And this whole question of the role Muslim raiders or Muslim kings and the way in which that's been objectified, and the motivations of the actions have been presented in certain ideological circles, and how it is that, in a sense, historians have a very important role in the face of any kind of ideologization of the public sphere to actually stand up for certain standards and approaches to inquiry and to better informing what the public sphere is discussing. And then the final one I want to mention, of course, is the most recent book, which we will probably speak quite a lot about today, which is India in the Persianate Age, 1000 to 1765. And I think it's important precisely because in recent years, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of use of this term Persianate, which of course we know was originally coined by Marshall Hodgson in his famous The Venture of Islam, which is still a work which one could argue is highly neglected in the study of Islamic history, but certainly should be read more extensively. I think it's coming back into fashion to a certain extent recently. And perhaps we'll discuss a bit this whole question of what do we mean by Persianate, what is the scope of it, and what might be the limitations of the term Persianate as we use it. So I just thought I'd mention these things as a wider contextualization of our conversation. So perhaps if we go back in a sense to the beginning, and if I ask Richard a broad question relating to the first two works, as I mentioned, on Sufis of Bijapur and on the rise of Islam and the Bengal Frontier, this sort of question about the study of Sufism within the study of Islam in South Asia, and the wider kind of theoretical contribution that these works make to the way in which we understand centers and peripheries and frontiers, perhaps, and what is the Islam that we are inquiring into in these contexts.
Well, thank you so much, Sajjad, and thank you, Mizan, for inviting me this afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be with you and share some of these thoughts. And yeah, as I'm listening to you talk about these previous works that I've written, it's interesting to kind of reflect, what I've been doing all this time, and what kind of impact it may have had or may not have had. But I guess the first thing I should say is that I was trained not in Islamic studies or not in a department of religious studies or something like that, but I was trained in graduate school in social history, in a department of history. Especially influential were thinkers like Phil Curtin and John Smale. Phil Curtin was an Africanist, actually, but he really pioneered world history long before it became standard teaching in undergraduate curricula across the world. And John Smale was a specialist in Indonesia, but was a colleague of Phil Curtin's at the University of Wisconsin, where I did my work. So I did my PhD in that environment. And when I went out to India to study conversion, that was my original plan. I wanted to understand why and how do Indians become Muslim, and how do we explain this? And why does it happen in one part of South Asia, but not in another part of South Asia? So I became interested in really thinking broadly about comparative history. I should also mention I was, apart from social history, I was trained in comparative history, specifically by Phil Curtin and John Smale. So my concern really was to try to situate Sufis in a specific social context. And why Sufis? That was because back in the late 60s, when I was embarking on this question of Islamization and conversion, every book I read said that, well, if you want to study conversion, you have to study the Sufis, because that's what they do. The Sufis were kind of held up as these individuals who were, and also this of course is the 60s, the period of hippies and beads and flowers, and people were kind of interested in so-called Eastern religions, and the works of Rumi was being translated big time in America. So Sufism was kind of in the air. And so I dutifully went to India and studied Sufis, expecting to find information about how it was that they converted Indians to Islam. And I found nothing about that. And I eventually came to believe that this whole idea that Sufis were interested in converting Indians to Islam is largely a myth. One of the few things that both Indians and Pakistanis agree on. And I'm convinced they're both wrong. So I ended up studying Sufis in a specific social context, and I became interested in who they actually were as social actors. And prior to that time, most works on Sufism were conceived of Sufis as almost kind of disembodied figures who were detached from society. They were mystics. They were somehow floating above or beyond an outside social reality. And I became fascinated with understanding what they actually did in society. And when I asked that question, that's really how the Sufis of Bijapur came out. I mean, the attempt to situate them in very specific, concrete social contexts. And that whole study was kind of prepared the way for getting back to the question of Islamization, which is what the Bengal book comes up. And once again, looking at the very concrete, specific political, cultural, economic, geographical context in which Bengalis became Muslim. But I could not have written that book without having already had this prior exercise with the Sufis of Bijapur.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one of the other things which I remember taking away from both of those works, in fact, was the this idea about the relationship between Sufis and power. Because
Right.
of course there was very much this assumption that Sufis kind of stayed away from power, right? They kind of stayed aloof from rulers, and I think your works actually showed quite clearly that this was just not the case. That
That's
actually
right.
the relationship between the two was quite intimate and very significant as well.
That's right. I mean, you have all this tradition. Well, really it was Khalid Ahmad Nizami who popularized this idea that if there was one order, if there was one Sufi order that did not immerse itself in politics, it was the Chishtis.
Yeah.
And that is simply wrong.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunately not the only thing which is wrong about his work on the Chishtis, but anyway,
right.
that's certainly one of them.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the other interesting thing, of course, about the way in which certainly kind of a more popular image of Sufism has developed, and this is perhaps more recently in the last 20, maybe 30 years, is this kind of notion of Sufism as, you know, somehow tied to Indian secularity, or,
Right.
you know, of coexistence and non-violence, and Sufis basically are very much opposed to violence. And this again seems to me a very strange kind of myth-making in the contemporary. I understand why it happens, but it clearly is a sort of a myth-making.
Yes, and chapter 2 of my Sufis at Bijapur is actually entitled Sufis as Warriors.
Yeah.
And I have to say, when I wrote that book, shortly after its publication, I got a handwritten letter of congratulations from none other than P.N. Oak. P.N. Oak is this rabid Hindutva kind of before the time Maharashtrian who wrote such books as The Taj Mahal is a Rajput Palace, who basically tried to erase Islam altogether from South Asia. And he welcomed the idea that here we have a non-Muslim Western scholar who is telling the truth that Islam is, after all, exactly what Max Weber had told us, which is a religion of violence and militancy, and so I was kind of, in fact, that book, there's a long history about it, why that book was thought to have been banned by the Indian government, but that's another story. I simply want to say that when I reread that chapter, especially when I got into working on Bengal, and I found a similar thing happening to Shah Jalal, the famous Sufi of Sylhet, 13th century, 14th century rather, visited by Ibn Battuta, famously. He also was referred to as a militant Sufi, but only according to Tazkaras, which is biographical dictionaries written in the 17th century. When I went back to my Bijapur book, I realized that the sources that were arguing for these militant Sufis of Bijapur were similarly composed in the 17th century. They were not contemporary with the 14th or 15th century. And that got me to thinking, well, what's going on in the 17th century that is causing people across South Asia to imagine Sufis as having been militant? And I never really wrote that up as an article. Maybe I will someday. But there's something to be said about the historiography of biographical dictionaries and what was happening in the 17th century that provoked these people to reimagining earlier Sufis as having been warriors. So in a sense, chapter 2 of my Bijapur book needs to be radically rewritten in light of my subsequent work and my understanding of this whole notion of militancy in Islam.
So what was going on in the 17th century, which you think might have accounted for this?
I think what's happening in the 17th century is that a Muslim community has now become dominant and has become part of a political imperial project, which is the Mughal project in the case of Bengal. And I think the community is trying to understand its own roots. And there's a moment of self-reflection which seems to be happening. And I think it's an idea that is generated within a dominant Muslim society that is trying to explain where they came from. I think that explanation happens to be historically wrong, but it has to do, I think, with the formation of a self-conscious political community.
Right.
I haven't thought this through, Sajjad, but this is something which I think deserves a lot of attention.
I mean, it could also be the fact that you have quite a lot of other kind of groups engaging in what you might call sacred militancy in the 17th century. I mean,
that's also true. That's right.
So the Sikhs, you've got kind of some increasingly militant, yoga, ascetic groups,
that's right,
and others, and of course, even within Sufis, you have lots of
that's right,
competition on this sort of issue. So the Naqshbandis in the 17th century are very much in favor of violence, it seems. So
that's right.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think of the work of Vijay Pinch and these warrior ascetics that he writes about and how they come into play. And there's no doubt that there's an increasing awareness of the other, of alterity.
Yeah.
And that needs to be historicized, I think, properly. And that's, I think you're right. That would be another way of looking at it.
Although, I mean, that's also interesting because I guess you could say one other common myth about Sufism in India is the way in which it contributes to syncretism, right? In which it kind of produces communities which exist across boundaries, across simple definitions of Muslim and Hindu and so forth.
Right, and I think syncretism is one of these words that I think is ready for the trash can. Unless you want to go into that, it's a word that has been bandied about a lot in the 1980s and 90s and the early part of the century. And I think more and more scholars are becoming disenchanted and dissatisfied with the kind of presuppositions which lie behind that word.
But it's interesting that in certain circles, for example, I'm thinking of primarily interfaith contexts, it's still a concept which people like.
Oh,
So,
yes,
you know,
because it suggests harmony and you know, togetherness and all kinds of warm, fuzzy things like that. But the problem with it is it also presupposes the idea of an earlier pure essence, which has implicitly become diluted into a kind of a mongrel hybrid, which is not pure. And anyway, so that's where you get it.
No, that's sometimes also related to this other kind of question, which I think to a certain extent has become more acute since Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam came out a few years ago, that you know, somehow the way in which we identify Islam and normative traditions within Islam has to somehow be associated with the Arab experience or the experience of the Central Lands. And then in contrast to that, what happens, say, in India or in Central Asia or China or, you know, the Malaccas has to somehow be diluted and impure.
Right. Well, this takes us to this question of center and periphery, which you hinted at earlier, and this is an area that I think which is really demarcated recent scholarship from earlier notions, you know, of the Arab world. And of course, it goes back to Marshall Hodgson, who really put the non-Arab world on the map of Islam, and radically decentered this idea that had informed so much Orientalist scholarship throughout the whole 19th century and most of the 20th century. This idea that somehow the periphery is the realm of a diluted, less pure, stunted, malformed Islam that needs to be corrected. And thus we have 19th century reformist movements. And I just want to say, one of my teachers on this, and one of my colleagues actually, Tony Johns, an Australian scholar of Islam in Indonesia, brought my attention some years ago to a 16th century Javanese text, which talks about a famous Sufi of Java, Sunan Bonang, who sent his pupil, his murid, off to perform the pilgrimage in Mecca. So he's sailing across the Indian Ocean, and he gets halfway to Mecca, and suddenly there appears the prophet, the famous Hazrat Khizr. This popular prophet, you know, associated with water and with esoteric knowledge. And Khizr tells this pilgrim, don't go to Mecca, go back to Java. Mecca is a false center. It's a false Mecca. The true Mecca is the Mecca in your heart. And for that, you need to go back to Java. And so the whole notion of center and periphery is completely inverted, you know, in this 16th century text, this Javanese text, which I think nicely captures this whole fallacy of 19th century Orientalist, European Orientalist thought. So yes, that again is one I think a major effort that I've been trying to deal with in myself, and kind of decentering all this with that comes to form the Bengal work, especially.
I mean, that's interesting because, of course, you know, you find that kind of decentering of the Central Arab lands even happening, you know, among scholars who are considered to be part of this normative tradition. So, you know, one thinks of, you know, Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi and some of his writings in the early part of 17th century, which, you know, in an early age, we probably would have described them as quite heterodox on the nature of the prophet or the prophet's ascension to heaven, or you know, the relationship between the believer and God. And so sometimes it's kind of centering on the experience of the individual and the relationship with God. Is there, even amongst the most kind of orthodox most normative thinkers that you can imagine.
That's right. That's right.
And also, you know, I mean, one thing which struck me when I first read Shahab's idea about Balkans to Bengal is how it basically seems to be the same as Nile to Oxus in Hodgson. So I was really not sure what was being added. I mean, I guess it's slightly further east, but it basically is
Right.
the Nile to Oxus kind of concept.
It is. It is. It is Nile to Oxus. It's just it's simply positioned a bit differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have to say I was a bit disappointed with that book by Shahab Ahmad. I mean, he raises the question of what is Islam, and I'm not sure he ever answered it.
No. I mean, again, no, I think it's actually an extremely useful thing to set for students to engage with, because it really, I think, maps out what the issues are. But I mean, I agree. I think his solutions towards the latter part of the book are not terribly convincing. And sometimes I kind of think, well, how is your hermeneutical kind of redefinition that different from Talal Asad's concept of the discursive tradition? Because it seems to be actually remarkably similar.
Yeah, exactly.
So, it's an interesting one, I think, to get students to engage with.
I agree.
As I indicated earlier, we'll be talking a lot more about the Persianate, but let me just ask you one further question before we get on to the Persianate. And that's, of course, about the temple desecration book, and this issue of, in a sense, what should a historian be doing in the face of certain kinds of public debates? One could argue that because of the way in which colonialist knowledge of places like India developed in the 19th century, and much of that was basically written by historians, or those who presented themselves as historians, that in a sense it is historians who have the duty to kind of overturn that or to flip it around. It seems that this is happening more and more. So is that how you see it, that it's really the role of the historian to engage in this?
I really believe it is. And I mean, I wrote that essay largely in response to a very specific event. And that's December 6, 1993, when or was it 92? When the Babri Masjid. 92, when the Babri Masjid was brought down by a mob of Hindu activists. And it was interesting to hear the rationales and the justification for that act that were advanced. And mostly it centered around an historical argument. The argument being that, well, we've had 1,000 years of Muslims destroying temples. What's the problem with one little mosque being destroyed? And there was a whole slew of books that appeared around the same time as the Babri Masjid incident, or shortly afterwards, that made rather strained attempts to use history to justify that kind of anti-Muslim violence. And when I looked closely at that, the evidence simply didn't seem to be there. And I decided, well, somebody needs to go back and look actually at what temples were destroyed or desecrated, and how were they desecrated, and when were they desecrated, and precisely where, what part of South Asia, and in what sequence, and in what historical context. In other words, I felt that what needed to happen was that some historian should come along and do what any historian ought to be doing on a good day, which is to explain why things happen here but not there, now but not then. To place things in a specific historical context is what I believe historians ought to be doing. And I saw all this rather irresponsible, reckless slinging around of dates and names of temples that had been desecrated. by Muslim rulers, and using very sloppy historical methodology. And I figured, well, what somebody needs to do, and if no one else is doing it, I'm going to do it. Good. Let's go back and look at the original evidence. Let's look at the epigraphic evidence, the inscriptions that do appear on mosques or that appear anywhere. Let's look at the original chronicles. Let's go back to the original Persian texts and try to get as close to these events as possible and map out, literally on a map, where did these temples, where were they located? When were they desecrated? And what kinds of patterns might appear if one looks both chronologically and geographically at this question. And I did that, and to my own astonishment, what appeared was quite clear pattern of a moving frontier, a moving military frontier, as Muslim states expanded across South Asia. You could see a pattern of royal temples, not ordinary village temples, certainly, but temples that were patronized by ruling houses, which were at war with a moving frontier of Indo-Muslim states. Those were the states those were the temples that were targeted, not any other temples. Or for that matter, not temples that had been royal temples, but those dynasties were no longer in power. Those were all disregarded. Those were let alone and ignored. So that drew attention to the political nature of these temple desecrations. And above all, the fact that once ruling houses had submitted, then those temples that were still patronized by former rulers were also left alone. Indeed, they were patronized. So this I thought was very important and it deserved an article. And I wrote that essay originally in the Journal of Islamic Studies in Britain. And then it got republished many times in India. And of course, it put me on a kind of a hit list for people who did not like the argument, were not happy to hear this news, who favored this kind of essentialist idea that Muslims are inherently violent, and there's this whole second commandment of what you have to do about idols and all this kind of thing. So yes, that article has had a long history. But it does take us back to your original question. I think historians really do need to engage with issues that inform today's political discourse. Because if we don't do it, then you're leaving the field open to demagogues who have little or no acquaintance with historical methodology or the historical past. And the reality is that this has happened, I think, unfortunately, in South Asia today. A lot of these popular ideas and mythologizing is being done by people who are demagogues, who really do not have an acquaintance with the past, who are not familiar with Persian language, and therefore do not have access to the very sources that could or could not substantiate their claims.
Well, I mean, one of the ways in which, of course, that happens and which makes it more pernicious is that it filters into school textbooks. So whether it's textbooks in India, which are kind of lamenting this, the rapacious and kind of cruel Muslim ruler, or whether they're textbooks in Pakistan, which are kind of, championing the likes of Rizvi or Muhammad bin Qasim, etc., and this kind of myth of the Islamic warrior conquering.
Precisely. Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more.
But it seems on that level, this kind of exigency for historians to act is becoming more and more acute. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, your piece came out roughly the same time as Romila Thapar's book on Somnath.
About the same time, that's correct. I think it was, around, well, it was the late 1990s that the original essay came out in the Journal of Islamic Studies.
Her book was about 2002 or something like that. Yeah,
something like that. Yeah.
And then, of course, more recently, I mean, perhaps the most obvious case is Audrey Tushka's work. And
right.
You know, Audrey gets so much abuse on particularly on Twitter.
I know.
And it's just kind of, it's absolutely crazy, the level of targeting.
Right.
Just for pointing out certain things. I mean, I think it seems the problem is it's a very polarized way of looking at it. So if you raise questions about these raids and the violence, it seems as if somehow you're exonerating all Muslim rulers of, you know, of any violence, so they were all great rulers and, you know, very benign. But of course, that's not really the point. The point is not that all rulers are bad or all rulers are good, but rather it's much more complicated than that.
Well, this goes to the question of what is history itself. And unfortunately, a great deal of history writing, especially in the popular kind of realm, is history as morality tales, identifying who was the villain and who's the hero. And it would be silly if it were not so serious and tragic. I mean, a figure like Aurangzeb, who was demonized in India and lionized in some quarters of Pakistan, you know, and it comes down to a question of, you know, is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? Is he a demon or is he a hero? And that's simply the wrong question. And which is one of the reasons I spent a whole chapter dealing with him in my Persianate Age book. I think, you know, there's not been a proper, a full-length biography of Aurangzeb in over a century, until Audrey Tushka comes along, as you just pointed out. But yes, I mean, so this is the problem. I mean, history is not simply a morality tale of identifying who's the hero and who's the demon. It's very complicated. What you need to do is try to keep the past in the past. That's difficult because the past keeps leaking into the present. It works around the corners and it finds its way into public discourse. But yes, that's the challenge.
I mean, obviously, it's not even just the school textbooks. It's not even just the Twitter and WhatsApp University, as it's now called. But it's also the fact that you have TV and film. I mean, not just in the Indian context. I mean, I'm thinking also of these kind of, you know, these dramas made by the Turks on the Ottomans.
Oh, yes.
Or, you know, like in Arabic, there's so many like historical dramas being made about early Islam, which are deeply sectarian accounts, you know. So that sort of, I guess, public conception of what history is kind of imbued in almost everything that we engage with, in you know, whether it's social media, whether it's TV, etc. And it becomes even more difficult, I think, for sane voices to really say, well, let's just step back and really think about what's going on here.
Yeah, social media has a lot to answer for in this respect. I mean, and this Twitter thing that's going on. I mean, anyone can say anything. And anyone's opinion is just as good as anyone else's opinion. And
it happens a lot. I mean, I find it so much myself. I have friends who kind of try to engage on academic material on Twitter, but there'll always be something that you tweet which someone finds offensive, and they say, no, that's not true. And you have no comeback on that. You can't just say, wait a second, this is what I work on. Actually, I know what I'm talking about.
That's right.
Because you were just another person on Twitter.
Exactly. And at the same time, you have the academic world and the professional world of, you know, historians who sequester themselves up in their ivory towers and refrain from engaging in these kinds of public debates. And there's kind of a polarization that's taking place between the Twitter world and the Journal of X studies. You know, and that's the problem.
I mean, increasingly, I think that is starting to change. I mean, I know a lot of people who are very active on Twitter, on Instagram, and you know, presenting really interesting elements of their research. But it's still, it's a tiny drop. And I think
That's right.
one of the reasons why we do it and why we kind of get encouraged to do it is because it's not just our peers. It's also a lot of grad students, it's a lot of undergrads. It is also, I think, a wider, you know, kind of populace who are interested in informed positions. So that's also going on there.
Exactly.
We could, of course, go on about this for a long time. Let me just take us to the, I think perhaps the issue that a lot of people might be waiting for, and this is the question around the Persianate.
Yeah.
Especially with respect to your own book, and also the way in which, to a large extent, the use of the term Persianate has become ubiquitous, at least in the last 10 years. You know, we've recently had a couple of volumes published on the Persianate, and a number of other publications which at least kind of index Persianate in the title somehow.
Right.
So I guess my question to you is, well, first of all, what do you understand by the concept of the Persianate, and how do you use it?
What I understand by it is a new and I think fruitful way of conceptualizing space itself, territory. You know, we live in the era of the nation state, where we see the world as like the map of the globe of the world. It looks like a jigsaw puzzle with each nation state with its own color. You know, kind of the Samuel Huntington vision of the world, you know, where every civilization and every nation has its own color and separate. And I think the idea of the Persianate, one of the reasons it's taken off is because it offers another way of looking at culture and also of looking at territory. And the idea of the Persianate privileges an idea of a trans-regional realm informed by a canon of literature.
Yeah.
Now, Shelley Pollack, I think, really is the one who gets a lot of credit here, and he's the one who inspired me to look at the Persianate world in much the same way that he looks at the Sanskrit cosmopolis.
Yeah.
Now, I don't use the word cosmopolis. I think that's too abstract. It's a Greek, it's a foreign word. I think the Persianate world is essentially the same idea, but what that world really refers to is a broad swath of territory informed by a canon of literature, which really first appears in the 11th century or so, and is remarkably stable. Although it's stable, but there's new things always coming into it. But there is a kind of agreed upon understanding of literature that is epic in nature. It's romance literature. It's storytelling. It's of course history. It's a wide range of literature that we're talking about here. But this world that I'm talking about is trans-regional because Persian, like Sanskrit, like Greek, think of the Hellenistic world after Alexander, when the Greek language was the language of prestige across the whole Mediterranean basin, extending all the way to India. Well, something of the same sort happens with Sanskrit and Persian. And all three of these, the Greek, the Sanskrit, and the Persian, are sustained by networks of circulation of both men and texts, which move about. And I mean, network theory, I think, is a very useful way of thinking about how the Persian world becomes institutionalized. You have madrasas, you have courts of kings, royal courts, you have Sufis in the khangas and dargahs, and there are people and texts that are moving between them across political boundaries. And these texts are understood as normative as well as prestigious. And these texts are imaginative in nature. They allow people, I mean, think of the Alexander epic cycles of the Secundernama, which gets written, of course, by Ferdowsi, by Jami, by Amir Khosrow. And these works have extraordinary range geographically, but also they allow people to imagine themselves as inhabiting in a world of Alexander, of Secundar. Never mind whether it's historically true. We're not dealing with history here. We're dealing with, obviously, a romance thing. But the ability to engage one's imagination and living in that world, and the fact that this Persian literature, I'm thinking of things like the Secundernama, get translated into Bengali, into Hindi, into Kashmiri, into Marathi, and so forth, means that this Persianate world is not just confined to works that are only written in Persian, originally in Persian maybe, but they have an extraordinary expansion. I mean, it includes, therefore, obviously Urdu and Deccani and Turkish, even Javanese. And so this idea of the Persianate world, I think, is a very, very powerful way of understanding culture and territory. And what also defines the Persianate world, and maybe in distinction from the Sanskrit world, is that Persian language, going all the way back to the Achaemenid Empire, was a language of professional scribes, whose job was administration, who worked for empires. So empires in Iran will come and go, but a class of scribes, they persist, and they're simply hired by the previous empire's scribes are simply hired by the next empire's rulers. And this tradition extends across this Persianate world. So it's not just literature. It's not just a circulation of Sufis or of men of arms or adventurers, but it's also scribal castes. So that when in India, for example, when Akbar declares Persian to be the official language of the entire empire, what happens is all these Hindu castes, such as the Kayasthas, Brahmins, learn Persian and become clerks. And so the Persian language infiltrates all these vernacular languages in many ways. It's not just the translation of works like, the Secundernama and other such things, but it's also the use of the language at the ground base level, out in the Mofassal, where Persian is the language of ordinary usage, and Persian words come to infiltrate all these vernacular languages in extraordinary ways. As much as 30 or 40% of Marathi was actually Persian. The same is true of Bengali before the 19th century. So it's a long way of saying that the Persianate world, I think, is an extremely fruitful way of thinking about how culture and territory merge. And it gets us out of the trap of thinking of nation states. It also gets us out of the trap of thinking in terms of religious communities as being the primary way of looking at especially in the South Asian past, as if you have 1,000 years of simply of Hindu-Muslim engagement as a prelude to the partition of 1947.
The Muslim interregnum.
Exactly. So, and that gets us to why it is that this word Persian has become so so electric, so popular among scholars, certainly in the last 10 or 15 years. I think in part it has to do with the search for an alternative to religion as the underlying key to understanding South Asia's past. The the rise of globalization has had a reaction in the form of all kinds of primordial identities, including religious identity. Whether you look at the United States or you look at Turkey, or especially you look at India, where you have this revivalism going on, and as a response to Hindutva,
yeah,
I think there's a lot to be said here. I mean, here you have Prime Minister Modi himself talking about 1,200 years of slavery.
yeah, no, and
Gulami, when he's referring to the very period of time that I'm trying to write about. And of course, when he says slavery, what he's really talking about, of course, are Muslims. And so, yes, I think the word Persianate has found, is filling a niche, which people have kind of been aware of, but have been not able to do until this word has come along, and help us understand, complicated things like the pre-modern period of Indian history.
I mean, even I guess you could say that this of course extends to the religions as well. I mean, it's very difficult to make sense of certain Sikh and Hindu texts without Persian. I mean, you can't make sense of the Guru Granth Sahib without Persian or Persian-inflected languages. And of course, there's this very rich kind of bhakti literature, which is actually in Persian, all the way through to the 19th century.
That's right.
And that's completely kind of forgotten. And I think this is partly also the way in which Persian as a language is increasingly seen in the subcontinent. So, I'm probably not the first person to note that Persian is very much in the decline, or the study of Persian in India and Pakistan is very much in decline. But it's also the way in which they are conceived of. So in India, it is, I think, very much associated with the Muslim past. And in Pakistan, there's kind of different ways in which it's partly about this past, but it's also increasingly associated with Iran, which of course now is a Shia state. So there's a forgetting of these major Sunni works, which of course were written in Persian as well.
Exactly.
It's a kind of a strange connection of the two.
And I think there's another reason that the word Persianate has taken off. I think there's two other reasons. I think one of them is that, Marshall Hodgson invented both the word Persianate and Islamicate.
Yeah.
And he used the word Persianate in a very restricted sense, one that Niall Green adheres to correctly. But he also has this idea of Islamicate, which took off as you're well aware, in Islamic studies throughout the latter part of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And many people have embraced it, still do. But to me, the positive thing about the idea of Islamicate was that it allowed Hodgson to look at the Islamic world through a lens that was much larger than simply Arab history and culture. But the fact that the word Islam is embedded in the word Islamicate always suggests that the Islamicate world must have something to do with religion. Religion in a very narrow sense of that word. And I always had the feeling when I was reading Hodgson talk about the Islamicate that what he was really talking about was the Persian world. And the word Persianate, it seems to me, is a much more useful and more accurate way of conceptualizing what Marshall Hodgson had in mind when he's looking at, for example, arcuate architecture in places like Vijayanagara, where you have palaces looking exactly like Persian mosques, with domes and arches and vaulting techniques and so forth. So I think that the word Persianate is a more useful term than Islamicate, although without Hodgson having already pioneered both those words, we may never have got there. I'll say that. And the other reason I want to put on the floor here is why I think the word Persianate has taken off is very, very simple. the Islamic Republic of Iran has basically forbidden Western scholars from going to Iran and do their work. And what this has meant is that many, certainly Americans, have not been able to, and we're trained in Persian after all, have not been able to go to Iran. And so they've been forced to look at places like the Caucasus or Tajikistan or Afghanistan or anywhere in Central Asia, and especially in India, to do their research. And in doing that, there has been this kind of an expanded awareness of a world, of a Persian world that is much larger than Iran. That in effect, what's happened is that scholars have been part of a kind of a denationalization of Iran. That Iran, ever since the late 19th century, appropriated, poets like Ferdowsi, famously, and all the rest of them for that matter. And what we're now aware of, more acutely than before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, is that Persian had always inhabited these areas outside the national frontiers of modern Iran. And that the fact that scholars trained in Persian cannot go to Iran, but can go to India and Pakistan and Central Asia and the Caucasus and so forth, the Balkans, that has enabled, I think, further pushed this idea of the Persianate and made it possible.
One of the interesting things is when people do talk about the Persianate, they usually mean, areas where Persian is spoken and then further east. Right. But what they very rarely look is west. So, I mean, you can easily include various types of literary cultures, for example, in Arabic, which are clearly inflected by the Persian. Whether it's translating Sufi texts into Arabic from Persian, or whether it's sort of practices, or even poetic styles. You find that, people talk about in the 16th, 17th century, they talk about the Sabk-i-Hindi with respect to Persian poetry, but the influence of that style on Arabic in the same period is immense. And yet there's very little work on that.
Right.
So it's interesting the way in which I think Persianate can be extended in a direction in which it's not being used yet, which is to the west.
That's right. Well, Niall Green's book is interesting in this sense. The one that you referred to earlier on, that just came out, the last year or so, where he's really thinking of Hudson quite literally and looking at all the areas outside of Iran. In fact, there's not one chapter in this book that actually deals with Iran, and going as far as China and Russia to look at this. So yes, the Arab world as well.
So I guess my last question, because I think we should open it up, is what are the limits of this concept of Persian? Does it come to an end at a particular point, or does it become such an elastic term that we seem to lose focus on what it really means?
I don't think there's any real danger of it becoming too elastic, because what I think what was always will hold it together is the idea of a canon of literature. And that canon has remained remarkably stable across more than a millennium. And the fact that, it's very easy to document that. You can look at, what are Mughal aristocrats recommending that their sons or their followers read? What are the books that Akbar himself is recommending that his officers, the Mansabdars, read? And there's a common core, and that core remains, as I say, remarkably stable over time. The danger you speak of, though, there is this idea of essentialism, and the idea that I can easily hear somebody objecting that, wow, this whole idea of the Persianate world is simply essentializing something into a static, unchanging essence. And my answer to that is that if there's no such thing as a Persianate world, then there really is no such thing as an Islamic world or a Christian world.
Yeah.
Because Islam and Christianity, Buddhism, these traditions ultimately are, and here I'm following Talal Asad, are ultimately based on texts, on scripture, on normative texts, which have remained normative over time. Now, granted, people interpret those texts differently. That is precisely what Hudson means when he talks about the venture of Islam. Yeah. There is a core, but there is also historical moments of interpretations that change. And I think the same thing is true with Persianate. I think people do interpret poems differently. But they're always referring back to what was Hafez saying in this particular line of poetry. I mean, I remember only 8 years ago, I was in Tabriz, a city that I lived in for 2 years back in the 60s. And I went back as a tourist and I was in a taxi cab. And it was fascinating because I was with an Iranian from Isfahan, a Pakha Iranian, Farsi native speaker. And the taxi cab wala was a Turk. And they got in an argument over a particular poem written by Rudaki.
Yeah.
Arguably the earliest famous poet of modern Persian. And I kept thinking to myself, this is fascinating. We have a Turk and an Iranian, and they're arguing over what was it that Rudaki really meant. And the important point is that the Turk was not this Azerbaijani Turk in Tabriz was not willing to cede any kind of privilege to an Isfahani in how this poem could be properly interpreted. And that's when I thought to myself, this is what the Persianate world is all about. It's arguing over, a common core of ideas, in this case, a poem by Rudaki, that is trans-regional. And it's trans-ethnic. You have a Turk and a Persian. So anyway, that's a long way of
I mean, of course, the interesting thing that kind of raises how we might extend that Persianate world now to, for example, Europe and North America, because you have Persian speakers and those whose culture is heavily inflected by Persian, in all these places as well. So you have these same kind of arguments going on about Saadi and about Maulana and Hafiz in LA and London and Berlin, etc. as well. So, well, thank you anyway, Richard. I think at that point we should probably open up.
Yes.
It's gone on slightly longer than we thought we would.
We've got a lot of questions. That was amazing, Professor Sajjad and Professor Richard. Okay, so I'm going to request first, I'm going to take the questions from the hands first. So Dr. Irfan, I'm just going to unmute you. So you're calling from India. Here you go. I've just unmuted you.
Okay, thank you. Since it is a very strange world that we are interacting with, so let me introduce myself. My name is Irfan Ahmed, and I work at Max Planck Institute in Germany. And thank you, Professor Eaton, for your observations. I have been a secret admirer of your work as an anthropologist. In particular, I like the book that you edited in 1993 from Temple University Press about Islam and world system. And your chapter in that book was also in my teaching courses in Australia. But anyway, since that is looking at Islam in terms of global connection, so my first question is this, and this is of a comparative kind. So it goes beyond Islam. and it relates to some of the myths that you have demolished in your work, but despite that scholarly deconstruction, they continue to persist. So Amitav Acharya, I don't know if you know him, he's a political scientist who does international relations. So in writing about the spread of Buddhism and Hinduism in China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, he invents this term called nirvana route, that how Buddhism and Hinduism spread from India through what he calls nirvana route, R-O-U-T-E. Okay. Now, comparatively speaking, if you take this term, and then, of course, the popular thing about Islam is that it is spread through violence and conquest and so on, right?
Right.
Then, of course, there are scholars who deconstruct it, but the myth persists.
Right.
Whereas in this case, it is such a nice new age term called nirvana route, you know. So my comparative question to you would be, to the extent that you do global history in a comparative framework, uh, in the spread of Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia, is it all this spiritual motive, or are there non-spiritual political uh, factors at stake or not? That is my first question. The second one,
Could you make it quickly, Alfred, because we've got about 20 people online.
As an anthropologist who very much engages in interdisciplinary work, but more importantly in philosophy. So I've been struck by this term called Indo-Islamic. There is no equivalent term called Indo-Hindu, right? And the assumption seems to be the same thing, that Islam is something in India and an outside force, you know. And this is not something R.C. Majumdar or Oak simply say, you know. Even Jaman Malik in his book, he has this notion of Islam as an outside thing, right?
Right.
So again, my comparative question would be that at least from Max Muller's time, you know, you do have this idea of Aryan race theory, and people like Nirasti Chaudhary would say that as Brahmin, his original home is in southern Russia, okay? But still, we do not talk, there is no public talk in India at least about Indianizing that route, that if they came from, or even Bal Gangadhar Tilak would say that, you know, his ancestors came from there. So it is their self-perception, you know, but there is no similar or kind of thing about Indianizing of those traditions, you know. Finally, and since you have been active probably from 60s and 70s, so this is another question as an anthropologist that I want to raise. If you look at if we look at anthropological works on Northwest Frontier Province, right? So people like Charles Lindham, Frederick Barth, they all wrote about the tribes. But in that period, these works do not show anything Islamic about these people. They are presented in terms of ethnic groups, tribal forms of life, you know, customs, and so on and so forth. And it seems like in the last 20 years, these people have ceased to be uh, ethnic or tribes, and what has instead been highlighted is simply Islamic aspect, and that too from a war on terror perspective. So how do you see that in these kind of works in those times, these scholars did not take Islam seriously, and afterwards everything became Islamic? So I want you to reflect on that kind of milieu of 70s, 80s, or 60s in your experience, especially beyond the realm of history as a discipline. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you for those questions. Um, they're all complicated questions, but let me try to be very brief then. So far as this idea of the nirvana route and the diffusion of Buddhism or Hinduism into Southeast Asia, and the parallels it might have with the diffusion of Islam into Central Asia or South Asia, I think what you're really talking about are vectors, which is to say the channels by which culture moves across space. And your specific question was whether there are non-spiritual motives that might be, or non-spiritual factors that might be involved in these with these vectors. And I would say yes, I would agree, absolutely. I mean, my work on Bengal was really centered around what was happening simultaneously with the rise of Islamic identity in Eastern Bengal that was not happening in Western Bengal. And the answer had nothing to do with religion, nothing to do with Islam at all, but had to do with the cutting of the forest and the rise of a rice frontier, the cultivation of wet rice. And there were correlations there between rice cultivation and Islamic identity that nobody seems to have noticed. And it occurred to me that this is largely because our academic universe is created or is inhabited by people with different disciplines. We have geographers looking at geography. We have economists looking at the economy. We have sociologists looking at society, political scientists looking at politics. And with everyone in their separate category, it becomes impossible to see the whole phenomenon. It's the whole story of the elephant and the 5 blind men. And I found it necessary to look at non-religious factors in order to explain religion, ultimately. And so I would agree with you that there are certainly non-spiritual, non-religious factors that have religious outcomes or implications. That's number one. Number two, you raised the whole question of Indo-Islamic. That's a very problematic term, it seems to me. But because it does go to the question of frontier and center. It suggests implicitly that that Islam is a foreign religion in India. That's why we have the hyphen. And hyphens always are very powerful punctuation marks that have to do ultimately with people's identity or claimed identity. And I think that's problematic because clearly Islam has become a thoroughly indigenized religion, just as much Indian as Hinduism or Buddhism ever were. And I think we need to acknowledge that fact. And so as long as we use these hyphens, we're going to have that problem of kind of continuing to see Islam as somehow not fully Indian. And your last question about the Northwest frontier and why it was that in the 19th century, I believe you were saying, these communities were referred to as tribes, and today they're not. I think that really speaks to what's happened in the course of the 20th century, and especially after partition, when people have come to see themselves more narrowly defined along religious lines than in non-religious lines. Although there still is the idea of the Qaum, of the Baradari. And those are still alive and well, I can assure you, in the Punjab today, in Pakistan today. But there's a difference of emphasis, I believe, between what was the case, say, in the 19th century. If you look at the ethnographies by people like Rose and others, and today, there certainly is a movement away from that word tribe.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for the questions.
Okay, so we've got, I'm going to get Cemil from Turkey. So Cemil, if you'd like to ask your question, I'm just going to unmute you now. Are you there? Okay. Okay, so I'll just go to Zalan. Oh, there you
Hello,
go.
can you
Okay,
hear
yeah.
me?
Yes, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much, dear Professor Eaton. I am Dr. Cemil Kututürk from Ankara University, Turkey.
Yes.
So, I am studying on Hindu-Muslim religion as well. I have been in Benares Hindu University for my second MA. So my question is, as you know, there are some different terms found in Hindu source to refer Muslims and Turks, like Hamira or Surat Rana. This kind of terms probably taken from Persian language. It's true. What's your opinion on this issue? Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you for the question. Absolutely. The word Hamira begins to appear already on coins as early as the early 12th century, I believe, are the first ones that show up. And Hamira is a word that gets indigenized by North Indian clans that we would now call Rajputs. It clearly is a word that comes from the Arabic word Amir. It does not have any prior Sanskrit origin. And it's interesting that that kind of reflects the way in which this word Amir, which is of course a Perso-Arabic word, has become indigenized among the ruling class, at least one ruling house, several ruling houses actually, the Chauhanas in particular, of North India in the 12th and 13th century. And the same is true of the word Sultana, which seems to be a vernacular form of the word sultan. And that again speaks, it seems to me, to how a Persianate idea or a Persianate word gets assimilated into vernacular tongues and is a very important index, it seems to me, of the diffusion of Persianate culture itself. And there are other terms that one can identify that were originally Persian, which become indigenized in Indian languages. And that is, I think, one of the most important ways of thinking about the Persianate world, is how vernacular languages assimilate Persian words into their own culture and their own languages. And we see that across South Asia. Hamira and Suratana certainly are among those. So thank you for that.
Okay. We've got Zalan. Zalan, I've just unmuted you.
Hello, yes, big fan of the book. I really enjoyed reading it. I had two separate questions. One was a minor sort of nitpick, I think. Okay. It was on the section on Ahmed Shah Durrani. There was a perception, well, it read in the book almost like it was had a slightly negative connotation to his role in the Indian subcontinent at the time. And I just, and I appreciate obviously that it's only a short section and space constraints in the book, but I was wondering about your thoughts on that one. And the second was, I've struggled with something quite a bit whenever I talk about history, South Asian history, particularly to colleagues and some of the work that I do. And one of the questions that gets posed to me is that, yes, there's loads of work by the Persianate sort of culture of the time in literature and everything else, but they would ask me to sort of pin me down and ask me, is there anything specific I could cite as an example of major scientific works that were done in comparison to sort of what was being done in sort of the Ottoman Arab world of that time? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, Ahmad Shah Durrani, I refer to him in my book as a warlord, and I got some criticism for that. And my response is that, you know, I mean, George Washington was a warlord before he became sanctified as president of the United States. I mean, Babur was a warlord. These people, I mean, it seems to me that this is not an uncommon route to rulership. And yes, Ahmad Shah Durrani was certainly a ruler, but he came to that by way of being a warlord. And if that sounds derogatory, I would only suggest that this is a very common route for many rulers, especially in pre-modern India. Your question about science is an interesting one. And I think my answer would be that insofar as the Persianate world is predominantly defined by a canon of literature, that is what I think is predominant in our conceptualizing the whole thing. Science and mathematics take a definite backseat to poetry and prose treatises. And so I think in that regard, you make an important point, that the Persianate world certainly is not primarily enlivened or inspired by scientific inquiry. And here I would cite the fact that one of the most important scientists of his day, Biruni, already in the 11th century, wrote in Arabic, not in Persian. And he really saw himself as a scientist, and he was a scientist in the sense that he wrote about geography, about astronomy. And I think that illustrates the point that there was and probably continues to be a certain gulf between the Arab and the Persianate sensibility. And one of the points of that gulf has to do with the location of science itself. Thank you for that question.
Great. I got a question from Rizwan. So Rizwan, I have unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions. First question is in relation to, you say people have exaggerated the role of Sufis in the conversion of the Muslim conversions in India. So what do you how do you explain conversions, and were they regional variations, in terms of how and when conversions happened, and how do you specifically explain the Bengali region? Why was that, unlike the Northwest, which is contiguous with the Islamic, the Persian world? So that's sort of understandable as to why Punjab, Sindh, are Muslim majority. But how did the Bengal, how did that become a majority, which is in the northeast corner of the subcontinent? So the conversions. So my second question is in relation to the Persianate influence on the vernacular languages and literatures of the Indic languages and literatures. Are there variations to the degree of the Persianate influence on those various Indian languages? And once again, why did Bengal being a Muslim majority region, why did they not adopt the Arabic-based script, unlike, say, the Bengali Muslims, that is, unlike Punjabi or Sindhi, which has the sort of Arabic-based script? Thank you.
Right. Well, your question about Bengal, I mean, the whole book that I wrote, The Rise of Islam in the Bengal Frontier, was aimed precisely at this question of how does one explain East Bengal as opposed to West Bengal, not to mention Bengal as opposed to any other part of South Asia. And this goes back to an earlier question that came up about looking at non-religious correlates. And to me, as I wandered around Bangladesh, talking to people about how their particular village first became Muslim, and I would actually ask that question to villagers out in the rice paddy. Invariably, the first Muslim was identified as also the first person who cut down the jungle and introduced the agricultural operations involving wet rice. And so that idea of correlating Islam with rice cultivation, which is something that happened in East Bengal much more than West Bengal, because West Bengal had already been brought under rice cultivation before Islam even appeared in the Delta area, whereas Eastern Bengal was not yet really Hinduized to any appreciable degree at that time, from the 13th to 14th century forward. So if we're speaking of conversion, that to me became a primary kind of entry point into explaining the whole phenomenon. And Bengal is quite unique in this respect, by the way. We cannot find any single explanation for conversion to Islam that will cover all of South Asia, much less all of the world. It seems to me that there are different vectors, different factors that need to be taken into consideration for each sub-region that we may want to look at. On your question about vernacular language and literature, let me just simply say that the infiltration of Persian language did indeed experience remarkable differences across South Asia. I mean, there's much more Persian found in say Hindi and Bengali and Marathi than there is in Malayalam or in Tamil, and one needs to talk about that and how that happened. To me, the most important factor is the degree to which local administrations use Persian in governance. And the reality is that across the entire Mughal Empire, Persian was the language of administration at the local level. And as I suggested earlier, in order for people to get jobs, they had to learn Persian and become scribes, work in the as pen pushing bureaucrats at the lowest level, and that is a very important vector for the infusion of Persian into vernacular languages. The question of Bengal and the persistence of the Bengali script as opposed to Persian script is really interesting. And my answer to that is that what you have in Bengal, and this is of course unlike not anywhere, but in most of the rest of South Asia, it's certainly the most important example, especially when one remembers that the whole rise of Bangladesh and the civil war, East and West Pakistan, was largely over the question of script. The attempt of Pakistanis to impose Urdu and Persian script on Bengalis was, as we all know, a major contributing factor to the uprising of 1972, 71, 72. So why did this happen? How did this happen? And it always seemed to me that the answer there is the fact that Islam was presented to Bengalis through the medium of Bengali literature, among other things. And you had poets such as Syed Sultan writing glosses on the Quran itself in Bengali and using Bengali language. Why? Because they wanted to communicate to people who were already semi-Islamized people who had been absorbed into a culture of mosques, not grand mosques, but small thatched mosques of bamboo and thatching out on the eastern frontier. And their task, and by the way, there's a fascinating book which has just been published by Ayesha Irani about the very question you're raising, which is the means, the mechanisms by which Bengali language and Bengali script were used as medium between Islam and the population of Bengal. And so the idea that the Nobi Bangsho, for example, is a classic case of this, of how the family of the prophets, or Islam itself, is seen as a point of continuity with earlier traditions in the Bengal Delta. And so the Bengali script was already there. These people were already speaking Bengali. And so it's not a question of translating the script of Persian into Bengali. You already had that script among these people. And what the consequence then was simply one of finding Bengali words and terms that approximated the same meaning in Arabic and Persian. So theologically, as well as in terms of script, what happens is a larger process of translation, and translation in the wider sense of not word by word, but meanings from Islamic theology into the Bengali universe. So that's a very complicated question, and thank you for that.
Yeah, we've got quite a few questions coming through the chat. I'm noticing of time. We've got so many questions on chat, Professor. So I'm some of them. Question on Urdu, modern Urdu and pre-modern Urdu. Can you comment? Has that reduced the scholarship level in terms of engagement of pre-modern societies?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
I think the person's trying to say, as modern Urdu and is in the state of Pakistan, and when Pakistani historians look at pre-modern India, has that affected their engagement? I'm not sure what the person's trying to say here. Question from Abu.
The Urdu language is simply a medium, so I don't think, no, I would answer no. There's been no, I mean, you can engage in pre-modern India in any language. And of course, we have important Urdu scholars who have done precisely that. So certainly that's not a barrier.
Okay. Another question from, okay, can you, sorry, it says, Kesa, I'm just gonna unmute you. You had a comment question, so it makes it easier because you've got Kesa. Right. Do you want to make your comment, Kesa Zaman? You there? Okay, no problem. Another question. How do you see Islamic Indicate studies going forward? What are your thoughts? What needs to be done? What's the future? What do we need to do?
You mean Islamic studies broadly understood, or what?
The history and Islamic studies in Indian Islamicate. That's from Mustafa.
Yes. Well, to me, what's most exciting about Islamic studies today, and I'm looking now to a lot of younger scholars who have, I think, really pioneered some new directions. I'll just give you one example. One of your colleagues, Sajjad, at Exeter, Nandini Chatterjee, has just written a remarkable book, kind of trying to understand what was law like in the Mughal Empire, and more specifically, what was Islamic law all about. And what she has done, and I think it's pointed a way for a lot of interesting, future scholarship, hopefully, is not to essentialize law as some kind of abstract static Sharia, this massive thing which kind of exists above and outside society, but rather to look at how local communities administered law and what the Sharia actually meant. And in her analysis, the Sharia really only meant legal as it was used by 17th and 18th and 19th century villagers in central India. And it really wasn't until the end of the 18th century that the British come along and decide that there's this thing called Islamic law and there's Hindu law. These are two different universes. You have the Dharma Shastras for the Hindus, you have the Sharia for the Muslims. And that kind of Orientalist thinking, I think, has persisted for a long time. And in terms of new directions of Islamic scholarship, I certainly think that one of the exciting ways of thinking about it is the area of law. I also think that many of the old stereotypes that we've inherited from Orientalists are being battered down and continue to be battered down. The idea of Muslims as warriors, which is an old Max Weber trope, Sufis as peaceful preachers or missionaries of Islam, that's been shot down. Sultans as autocratic tyrants. These are some of the ideas that we've inherited. Or the idea of the ulama. We've inherited an idea that the ulama, the clerics, are this bunch of stodgy conservatives who are rather uninteresting. And the lines between Sufis and ulama have become increasingly blurred in newer scholarship. And that to me is another interesting direction that we need to look at and is happening. So those are just a few of the ways that I think the future of Islamic studies is going, at least with respect to India.
Awesome. Got a couple more questions and we're going to be ending soon. So Mahmoud Hassan, would you like to ask your question? Yep.
Hello. Hello.
Yes. You can ask a question.
Can you hear me? I'm Dr. Kamrul Hassan. I'd like to ask you a question. Thank you for your deliberations, and it's very sort of good and enlighten us. My question is, what is happening in the current ruling class in India, for example, and even some context in Bangladesh as well, to try to revise the history? And a historian like Romili Thapar and many great historians from India are really worried what they are doing now for the curriculum, textbooks, even in school and their other higher studies. So are you worried, or do you think it is something to do, although it's a political, but no political government in India before took this sort of initiative to change or revise the whole thing in an academic way? So what's your observation and view? Are you worried for the future?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's a very important question. Let me just say that one of the discouraging things about India today, South Asia today, is the degree to which history has become politicized. History has become a football. And a lot of history writing has kind of fallen into the hands of amateurs and demagogues. So you rightly point out that scholars like Romila Thapar, there are many others, Harbans Mukhia, I can name a whole list of people who have made, I think, very important efforts at looking at the past on its own terms, trying to depoliticize history in India and the way it's taught. And you're quite right. Textbooks tend to be rewritten with each new change of power in India, and this is very disconcerting. So am I worried? I am concerned that the direction we're going in now could be very unfortunate if this existing regime I'm referring to the BJP government right now, which seems to be demonizing the past. I referred a moment ago to this idea of 1,200 years of slavery. And it seems to me that this is precisely the time when professional historians need to step up and make their voice heard. I am confident, however, that this more enlightened understanding of the past will prevail. I mean, I have to hope that, otherwise I wouldn't continue to write books and be engaged myself. So thank you very much for that question as well.
Okay, we take a final question from Aisha. So Aisha, I'm just gonna unmute you. We've got quite a few questions, but I think we've gone well over time. But Aisha, yeah, from Pakistan.
Okay, hello, this is Aisha Sayed from Pakistan. And thank you very much. It has been a pleasure hearing you. I'd just like to ask you a question. In your opinion as a historian, is it intellectual dishonesty to portray a people or build a perception about a community that is in contradiction to reality? And has this been done in a planned manner in the subcontinent to achieve certain goals? And a question that arises from this is that if this has been done, and if history has been used as a political tool, how can we take historical facts at the value that they are presented in? And how can we uncover the realities behind them? Take, for instance, the issue of partition of the subcontinent and whatever narratives have been built around it. This is just for an example. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha.
Well, that question really does strike at the heart of what all historians face as they confront the past. And I will simply say that we are all conditioned by the particular moment that we live in. We cannot escape the 21st century. We are in the 21st century for good. And we inevitably, therefore, bring to our craft, to our efforts to understand the past, the values, the prejudices, the concerns, the whole baggage that we live in day to day right now. And this means that we have to acknowledge where we're coming from, while at the same time trying to understand the past on its own terms. To me, the greatest challenge of writing any history is to try to remove all of our present day prejudices and concerns and look at the past on its own terms. To look, if you confront a manuscript, a tazkara or a chronicle, a tarikh, whatever it might be, try to look at those words through the prism of what those words meant at that time, and not how those words have been interpreted today. That is the challenge. Unless we can understand how people behaved in their own day according to their own worldview, instead of looking through the lens of our worldview, then we will perpetually be abusing history. This is why it seems to me the partition of 1947 has posed a special challenge to historians. We all know that partition is still very much a living reality, literally living reality for those who actually were part of that partition and the disruptions that it caused. And so to me, one of the great tragedies is the different ways in which history has been written in India and in Pakistan. Histories of the same area, of the same dynasties, presumably of the same people, are looked at through sometimes entirely different lenses. We see this especially in textbooks that are commissioned obviously by the governments and approved by the governments. So historians, in a sense, it seems to me, are the ones that we should probably look to situate ourselves in our own time, because historians are also the same people who are trying to situate earlier periods. And it's that dialogue between the present and the past which is always going to be with us. the past is a foreign country, and it will always remain a foreign country, but we have to do our very best to plant ourselves in that past and try to understand it on its own terms. Thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. That brings a nice ending. Professor Richard, it's been wonderful hosting you. We've gone well over time. I'm sure we can go for hours. But before I close up, I mean, let me just quickly remind you, once COVID and the flight issues, you know, we're allowed to fly, we'll hope to bring you back to London again and
Yes.
do a complete Indian Islamicate sort of week in intensive. But I'm going to hand it over to Professor Sajjad to round up and close up, who's been a wonderful host as well and an excellent interviewer. And then, yeah, and we'll close. But once again, thank you so much for myself. But Professor Rizvi, please.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure for me as well. We haven't met before, Richard, but it's been a good conversation, and I hope we can have them in future in better circumstances as well, as we in Exeter and in other places also, I think, engage a bit more with what's happening in the South Asian context with respect to the study of Islam. And I certainly think, I hope that when people watch this later, there'll be many sort of questions and issues that will arise, which they can, of course, take up. And for those who haven't read the books, they should go and read Richard's books, obviously, in particular this new one, Indian Persianate Age. So thank you once again from me as well, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in.
Thank you so much, folks. We'll send you the link to the recording. If you're not on our mailing list, just leave your email on the chat. Otherwise, we'll hope to see you in our next session. So once again, thank you so much, Professor. Thank you so much, Dr. Rizvi. Have a nice evening or a nice afternoon, wherever you are, or wherever you are in the world at the moment. We've got folks as far as Malaysia and as far as back as LA. So this is the world we're living in now. But it goes to show there's a lot of interest anyway in the subject, and we can really develop. But other than that, thank you so much. Have a nice evening. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you.